As you know, we've been systematically working our way through the book of Romans. I think we're somewhere between 25 and 30 weeks into it at this point. And believe it or not, we're actually getting near the end. There are 16 chapters. We were ready to go into chapter 14 today, except I started looking at it over the last couple of weeks, and there's so much in chapter 14, I don't really want to split it. I'm going to be on vacation for a couple of weeks, and I don't want us to be in a situation where by the time we get to the second sermon, none of us, including me, remember what we talked about in the first part of the chapter. So we're going to set Romans aside for a little bit until we have an uninterrupted string of Sundays, which will be in July, it looks like. We'll be back to Romans. But today, if you didn't know, it's Father's Day. For those of you that forgot to mention that, might want to just say that right now. At the end, like we often do on Mother's Day and Father's Day, we are going to take some time at the end of the service to have a child dedication, a baby dedication. We're still playing catch up after the pandemic. So we have 4 families that at the end of the service today are going to come up here and join me at the end of the service and make that declaration, that commitment, that expression of their faith as it relates to their role as parents. And so I decided to do a message today that's going to tie in with that. We're going to be in a text in the Old Testament that speaks to the responsibilities of parenting. And so there's going to be some direct application for many in the room, not just those dedicating their children today, but many who are actively engaged, currently engaged in that grand adventure. But this passage also speaks to the rest of us, even if we don't have kids, or even if our kids are grown, or even if we're the kids. This is going to apply to us because as the church, we are part of something that by its design, by its nature, is transgenerational. It's transgenerational, meaning it's not just about our experience during our lifetime, but it's about those that came before us and passed on the faith to us. And it's about those who will come after us, and it's going to continue after we're gone until Jesus comes back. There's this continual handoff that has to happen. There's this uninterrupted transmission from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And if at any point that falters, then as the church, we will have failed. That's on all of us. This, of course, ties in with our theme for this year that some of you will remember we introduced back in September, back in the fall. Run strong, pass it on. We walk by that banner out there in the foyer. I can see it from here every time we come up those stairs, and probably don't even look at it anymore. But it's the idea of a relay race and the importance of passing along our faith, both generationally, as we're talking about this morning, but also personally. Each of us, as we're on our front lines, making an impact on the people around us. Here's the passage. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6. That's the 5th book in the Old Testament. What's happening in Deuteronomy is the people of Israel have been rescued from slavery in Egypt back in Exodus. God has established them as a nation there at Mount Sinai. They're a people belonging to Him under the laws that He gave them. Since that time, they have wandered in the desert for 40 years because they didn't initially trust God and they didn't enter into the land as He had instructed them to do. So now in Deuteronomy, it's at the end of those 40 years. The nation is gathered just across the border on the other side of the Jordan. It's a whole new generation ready to move into the land, this time for real. And Moses, their leader, before he dies, is giving them last-minute instructions. He's reminding this new generation of God's commands, of God's ways, of God's promises, and their responsibilities before Him. So here's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1. Moses says, "Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments," that is the rules, the standard of conduct, "which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, not just so that you may know them, but so that you may do them in the land where you are going over to take possession of it, so that you, your son, and your grandson," and understand that's not meant to exclude your daughter and your granddaughter. NIV is not wrong to translate this as your children and their children after them. That's what he's saying. but so that each of those generations will fear the Lord your God and keep all his commandments and his statutes which I command you all the days of your life, so that your days may be prolonged. So God's plan here goes beyond just the actual individuals who were standing there in that moment next to the Jordan River, looking across into the promised land, and personally hearing Moses with their own ears speak these words. Moses says, this is for you, and it's for your children, and it's for their children, the next generation. Now, what we need to remember is that in many cases, that next generation, that last generation that he talked about, doesn't even exist yet. They haven't been born at the time. Because remember, everybody who had been an adult 40 years ago when Israel refused to enter the land, all of those people, that whole generation has died off. So we're only looking now at those that were, maybe teenagers or whatever 40 years ago when Israel failed, when they didn't go into the land. They've grown up, they're in their 50s now, and so it's just that generation and maybe the next generation. Maybe a few babies in that third generation have come along. So there are really only a couple of generations here on the scene in Deuteronomy. But see, God in this passage, speaking through Moses, is talking big picture. He's looking ahead. He's looking down the road. This relationship that he has established with these people is intended to last. It is to extend well into the future, far beyond the lifespans of the particular Israelites who are standing there listening to Moses at the time. It was transgenerational, in both directions, actually. Let me show you that in verse 3. He says, now Israel, you shall listen and be careful to do them, that is, do all these instructions and commandments, so that it may go well for you, and that you may increase greatly. See, that's pointing to those future generations. That's when this increasing is going to happen. Just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, now that's the look back, as the God of your fathers has promised you. The faith that they were to pass on to future generations is actually the same faith that was passed on to them from those that came before them, going all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It goes all the way back to Genesis. He's reminding them, look, this baton has been passed to all of us, and it needs to keep going. It can't stop here, Moses says. God's plan here is long term. And those future generations are going to experience it only if you remain faithful, if you carry it forward. This is God's message for the whole nation because it affects everybody. Now, you don't have to look very far beyond this particular time in Old Testament history to discover that this kind of generational momentum, if you will, is very hard to sustain. As you look through the Old Testament history, the history of Israel from this time forward, you find that there are times when Israel was pretty much on track. People were generally in a good place. They're more or less following God's law. Of course, never perfectly, but there were times when they were doing reasonably well. They're living out their faith. For the most part, they're being faithful to God. But then the next generation would come along. There's a different king or whatever, and virtually overnight there would be this dramatic turnaround for the worse, the beginning of this downward spiral that would erase any progress that their parents' generations had made. Here's one particularly clear example. This is Judges chapter 2. And this is going to be shortly after the people of Israel have settled into the land. Which means this example that I'm about to read starts with some of the people who were standing there across the Jordan listening to Moses in our passage in Deuteronomy 6. Here's Judges 2, starting with verse 7. It says, the people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things that the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at an age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance, and it specifies where that was. Verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baal, some of the gods of the Canaanites. Verse 12, they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and they served Baal and the Ashtaroths. Verse 14, in his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. And see, this is just one generation removed from our passage in Deuteronomy. That's the scary part. This is your son and your grandson. This is your children and their children after them that Moses had cast the vision of those generations fearing the Lord as long as they lived and doing well in the land, keeping his decrees and commands so that it would go well with them and so that they could enjoy long life. It's been only, 50 years? Maybe 80 years? And that vision is gone. That momentum has come to a screeching halt within just a couple of generations. The faith has not been passed on. And God, who remains faithful, has to intervene in order to bring them back. And that's a painful process, Now, this is not just an Israel thing, and this is not just a thing from history long, long ago. This is very much a current issue for the Church of Jesus Christ today. The challenge and the critical importance of passing along a vibrant faith to the next generation will always be with us until Jesus comes back. Someone redirecting a famous quote, I think the original was about freedom, but he said, Christ's church at any moment in history is just one generation away from extinction. Just one generation away from extinction. And it's been that way from the very beginning. All it would take is for one generation to fail to pass the torch to the next generation. Now, understand, theologically, God would never let that happen. That's never going to happen, at least on a global scale, because remember, Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The church with a capital C is never going to go away. It's never going to die out until the Lord comes back. But it can happen to a local church. And all you need to do for evidence of it here in New Hampshire is look around at some of the historic buildings, the old meeting houses that once were living churches, that once were active faith communities, but now have been converted into homes and businesses, or they're museums that are open one day a year for Old Home Day in the summertime. There's one at the bottom of the hill here in South Sutton. There's another one right across the street from the Grover's house. Somewhere along the way, the generational handoff didn't happen, and those local churches died. The sobering reality is that can happen even in a church like ours. See, what we would like to assume is that, the kind of churches that die out, those are churches that have drifted away from God's word, from the truth of his word. But that's not always the case. Relevant enough, or recent enough to be relevant now, was a study, I think this was maybe 10 or 12 years ago, that was put together by the Barna Group and Lifeway Research, that found that out of every 10 high school students that attended a church on a semi-regular basis, out of 10 of those, after high school, about 7 of them would disappear. They would walk out the church doors after they graduated and never come back, at least not for a long time. Now, some of those may eventually drift back in. For example, when they have a family of their own. And I know some of you, that's your story. But statistically, that's a very small number, leaving not even half of those original 10 who were in church as kids who are now gone and who will never come back. And that's concerning when you consider the future of the church. That's when you consider this generational progression that we're talking about. That's something that affects all of us in the church. And that's why we will, at Trinity, always make it a priority. And we will ask the church family to make it a priority to support the parents here at Trinity who are actively engaged in raising the next generation. Now, I want to be clear, Christian parents are the ones who are ultimately responsible for discipling their own children as followers of Jesus. And in a minute, we're going to press further in the passage and see how that's supposed to work. But we shouldn't make any parent do that in complete isolation. That's not biblical. That's not how the body of Christ was designed to work. From the research, same research, statistically, one of the key factors that predicted which teens were more likely to stick around after they graduated into adulthood and still be part of the church, and which ones were going to go away, was whether their moms and dads were, number one, together, and number two, whether they attended church regularly, whether they both did. There was a strong correlation between those two things and the probability that the kids would stick around. But the study said that another key predictive factor about who would stay and who would leave was whether or not there were other adults in the church who had made a significant investment in those kids, both personally and spiritually. You may remember if you were at our church retreat this year, our speaker there cited the same statistic. I think he may have been looking at the same study that I was looking at. Those kids who had experienced that kind of connection with other adults at church, besides just their parents, were more likely to keep their feet grounded and to stay around as young adults, which means as a church family, there's so much that we can do. There's a lot that we can do to support parents in this sometimes daunting task of raising the next generation of faithful followers of Jesus. For some, that's going to look like volunteering for some official ministry position in our youth ministry, our children's ministry, and that sort of thing. But it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be that at all. Just taking an interest in the next generation would go a long way. I don't know if you've noticed, we've got a lot of kids around here, and we've got a lot of really great kids. How often do you stop and talk to them? Or do you only talk to their parents? You know, what if each of us were to take a genuine, heartfelt interest in some of these kids that join us? Getting choked up here. Ask them about their lives. You know, it doesn't have to be a creepy thing, right? Just spend a few minutes and find out what they're interested in. Find out, you know, what God is doing in their life. Let them see what God is doing in your life as well. Let them catch your love for the Lord. In the meantime, let's press on in our passage to see what Moses has to say to parents about their critical role in preparing the next generation. Here's verse 4. He says, Hear, Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Now, you recognize this, of course. This is the commandment. This is the verse that Jesus went to first when someone asked him, what's the greatest commandment in all the law of Moses? He immediately quoted this verse, love God with everything that you've got, everything that you are, with your whole being. And then he went on to sew that together with love your neighbor as yourself, which you remember we just looked at last week in Romans chapter 13. But here in the context of handing off the faith to the next generation, the point Moses is making is that living in relationship to God is what life is really all about. That's the bottom line. Think of all the things that parents have to get across to their kids, sometime between when they're born and when they go off into their own lives. I mean, you have to teach them what the bathroom is all about, and they finally get to that point and they know what to do and when to do it and that sort of. That's important for them to learn. They need to learn to dress themselves, because you don't want to be dressing them when they're going to middle school, right? They need to learn to share their toys, particularly when siblings come along. They need to learn all kinds of safety issues. Don't touch the wood stove, don't run across the parking lot without looking, those sorts of things. They need to learn their shapes and their colors and to count and to read and to write. They need to begin to take on responsibility. And so we give them chores, little chores going on to bigger chores, how to deal with disappointment, how to deal with rejection, how to deal with success even. And then they become teenagers. And things get really complicated from there. We have to show them how to handle money. We have to teach them how to drive a car, including the stick shift, Hannah. There's a story there, but I won't go there. We have to walk them through making major decisions in life. So much that we have to get across in what is really a pretty short time, I can say, looking back on it in my personal experience. I mean, 15 years maybe they're listening to you. If you're lucky, they'll keep listening for a few more years after that. And all of that stuff has to get across. But the sum of all those kinds of life lessons is not truly what life is all about. It's not just about navigating through all those kinds of things. The whole point of life is a relationship with God. I mean, that's why he created us. He made us in his image to have a relationship with him. And that's what Moses is saying. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. Guess what? Our kids are not going to pick up that on the playground. They're not going to catch it from the things they watch, the cartoons that they watch, or the books that they read. They're probably not going to catch it at school. Even at a Christian school, that's not really where they're going to get it. Where the kids need to learn that a relationship with God is the centerpiece of life and that everything revolves around that is from their parents who are living it at home and at work and in every other context and who are talking about it with their children. Verse 6, he says, these words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. That's where it's got to start. And you shall repeat them diligently, New American Standard says. Other translations of that phrase, you shall teach them diligently. You shall impress them on your sons and your daughters. Repeat what? Teach what? Impress what? Well, Moses says it's these words, these things he's been talking about, all these things he's been reinforcing. I mean, you could generalize that. What we need to reinforce, what we need to teach and impress is the teaching of God's word. That's up to the parents to get it across. NIV is the one that renders this verse, impress these things on your children. The picture here is of a wax seal. And you'll see some parents who are participating get up and go get their kids from the nursery because that was their cue. A wax seal, you know how that works, right? There's a candle. Maybe you have a little stationery kit, and so when you write it, you put the note in there and you close the envelope and you take this candle and you drip the wax right onto it. And it's soft, and then you take this cool little brass thing and you make the impression on it. You know, that only works when the wax is fresh. If you drip that wax on there and you let it sit for, a couple of weeks or a couple of years, you're not going to be able to mash the thing down probably. We have to start early with our kids. There's a different word picture as well that's suggested by that same Hebrew word in verse 7. Literally, you could translate that word to sharpen. Sometimes it's used in a context where it means that. And so picture sharpening a knife. Years ago, my father-in-law gave me, I think he called it Japanese water stones. They're about yay big, little rectangular, heavy stone of some sort. They're kind of the color of terracotta. One of them is a little coarser than the other, and we store them in a little plastic container down in the basement that's full of water. They're water stones, so they have to stay wet. And there's nothing automatic about sharpening a knife. I mean, what you have to do is, in our case, we have to go down to the basement, pull that thing up, get the stones out, and then take the knife and hold it at a certain angle and kind of rub it around at the kitchen sink with the water running on it. And we do it this way, and then we do it this way, and then we switch to the other stone. A whole process. What it takes is friction between the steel knife and the grit on the stone. It takes some physical effort on my part. It takes some patience because it's not instant. Ultimately, it takes the will to do it. I have to be intentional about it. And if I wait until I'm ready to carve the Thanksgiving turkey and I haven't sharpened it, then it's not going to work very well. I have to make it a priority. And then the knife gets dull again, and we have to do it all over again. And that's where diligently in some of the translations comes in. Same thing with sharpening our children, with instilling in them our faith so that it becomes theirs. That's not going to happen by itself. It takes moms and dads being intentional and being systematic and being responsive to teachable moments, even if it's not at a convenient time, because often they're not, and patient, because there's no such thing as express parenting. This business of passing on our faith to our children is a 24/7, 365 kind of thing. And that's the point that Paul's going to make. In verse 7, he says, you shall repeat them, you shall teach God's ways diligently to your sons, and speak of them when you sit in your house, when you walk on the road. when you lie down, when you get up. What he's describing there is the dimensions in which we who are parents are to be impressing, sharpening, teaching our kids how God fits into their lives. The first dimension is space. He says when you sit in your house and when you walk on the road. In other words, when you're near and when you're far, when you're at home, when you're away from home. In other words, everywhere is where we should be doing it. Anywhere we are with our kids, everywhere we are, we should be in that mindset. And then he addresses the dimension of time. He says when you lie down and when you get up, the beginning of the day and the end of the day, which means not just the beginning of the day and the end of the day, but everything in between. This is a figure of speech that you see a lot in Scripture called a merism, for what it's worth, M-E-R-I-S-M, where the end points, the extremes are mentioned in order to include everything in between. For example, if I say this is for young and old, I'm not saying this is just for those that are under 20 and over 70, right? Young and old means everybody. You get the idea. So when you lie down and when you get up means anytime and every time. Good morning. Those are pretty, aren't they? What we're saying is that the context for impressing these things on our children is life. It's the context of life, daily life, everyday life. Yeah. And one thing that implies is that it's not just for a family devotion time. Family devotion time is great. A lot of families do that, where we spend some time, maybe at the dinner table or maybe at bedtime, where we read some scripture and we talk about it and so forth. Absolutely, don't stop doing that. Just don't make that all you do. Why? Because it's the same effect as if we make Sunday morning. I mean, think about this, and I hope that none of us do this. But if we make Sunday morning our only time during the week when we focus on the Lord and how He relates to our lives and how we relate to Him. I go back to verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. Which means one day a week, Sunday morning, if that's all you're doing, that doesn't cut it. That doesn't measure up. So in the same way, only a family devotion time once a day, part of the day, doesn't adequately communicate how important and how central our relationship with God is to all of life. It's not like we can compartmentalize. There's no such thing as there's related to God things and not related to God things. There aren't any not related to God things. And so we need to understand that our relationship with Him relates to anything and everything. Now, some of us may have a hard time impressing that on our kids because, honestly, we haven't impressed it on ourselves. Verse 6, these words which I'm commanding you today shall be on your heart. On your heart. That's where it has to begin. It has to start with the parents. And that's why whenever we have a baby dedication, a child dedication, it's really more about the parents than it is about the children, okay? It's the parents who are making this commitment before God and before His people. It's the parents who are expressing their dependence on God and who are asking God for His grace and His strength and His wisdom for this task because they realize, like we sang earlier, Lord, I need you in this task. It is the parents whom we together as a church are supporting. We're committing ourselves to support and encourage and work together with and hold accountable for the sake of these children and for the next generation of the church. So I think the Monroes are ready. Let's have all the families that are going to participate in the dedication come on up at this point.